This is a disgusting ideology responsible for the deaths of millions of people.
Condemnation came thick and fast.
We're a bunch of cowards acting in a cowardly and disgraceful way with the sole purpose to try and intimidate.
This is a real insidious, hateful ideology, and we need to deal with the root causes of it and rip it out by the roots.
Neo-Nazis storm an already tense clash on Saturday between what some have dubbed anti-trans demonstrators and counter-protesters.
Look at the Nazis! Look at the Nazis!
30 mostly masked men clad in black in an odious display performed the Nazi salute on Parliament steps.
We are revolutionaries!
And right there is Victorian Liberal MP Moira Deeming, one of the speakers at the event.
The LGBTQI can have their rights, that's fine, but why does it involve taking away everybody else's rights?
Today, her own party is calling for her scalp. Leader John Pesutto says he'll move a motion to boot her from the party.
Moira Deeming has had an association with people who organised the rally, who have shared platforms with and viewpoints with people who promote Nazi views.
The Andrews government also moving swiftly. Victoria was the first state to outlaw the Nazi swastika. Now it's considering banning the salute too.
We had been advancing it in the context of improving hate crime laws in Victoria. We'll now fast-track this element given the events of the weekend.
New South Wales has joined the ban. Tassie and WA are moving to outlaw swastikas. Queensland also banning tattoos of the hate symbol. But is this all evidence that Nazism is on the rise in Australia?
Far-right extremists have very little support. They are desperately looking for attention. They want to recruit, they want to influence, they want to groom. They want to provoke a response from the media so that the public pays attention and people go looking for them.
I can't even believe in 2023 we still have to say this is unacceptable in Australia.
Nick McKenzie is a leading Australian investigative journalist who's explored the rise of neo-Nazism here in Australia, and he joins us now. Nick, we see this sort of public spectacle, these sorts of stories hit the media, but do they actually indicate that Nazism is on the rise in Australia?
I'm not so sure they do. The neo-Nazis would love us to think that's the case, and there's a real risk that we're platforming groups like the NSN. But what we can say is it's certainly a virulent threat. I mean, these guys absolutely breed hatred. They should be viewed as a dangerous threat in our society. Are they growing bigger? Well, it's very hard to say. But do they have enough members and are they organised enough for us to be worried? Absolutely.
In fact, Nick, your investigations have uncovered far-right extremists within the Australian Defence Force. So how worried should we be?
Well, this is something we published the day before the protests in Victoria. I mean, really, if there's people with neo-Nazi histories entering our Defence Force, we should be very worried. And, I mean, I think it's a good thing the Defence Force responded proactively. They've launched investigations into how, I mean, a couple of these soldiers have very deep neo-Nazi histories. They've been part of groups that have been investigated by ASIO. These groups are known to engage in really sort of high-risk activity. So how someone could be in one of those groups and then a year or two later join the ADF raises a whole range of questions about vetting. I mean, ultimately, the deep concern is that groups like the NSN want people with military training. They want people with firearms licences. They see themselves as engaged in a war against society. And they preach this sort of doctrine where they want society to collapse, and when it does, they want to be ready to fight for white supremacy.
Nick, I'm always fascinated how these people find each other. In your work, what did you find to be the main reasons that young men in particular were attracted to joining this cause?
Some of them are simply misfits looking for tribe and brotherhood. Think of a bikie club and the sort of guys that might end up in a bikie club. They can be socially isolated and they find belonging. They find it often online, and they move from online bonding over conspiracies and shared hate to meeting up in person. One thing the NSN tries to do is to get people through its clubhouse doors to start training, to start martial arts training, weapons training. They've talked about buying tracts of land in rural Victoria and elsewhere to ultimately start an ethno-state. It sounds crazy, but that's their aim. But these guys coalesce over this shared purpose, and suddenly somebody who's had no purpose in their life has a great deal of purpose. And one really good way to look at these groups is like cults. I mean, the leader of the NSN, Tom Sewell, is a cult-like figure who preaches conspiracy, preaches hate. but he's in his own way to these members charismatic, as a cult-like leader is. And so he brings people, young men, along with him. And sometimes it's far too late until they realise they've ruined their lives and they can't get employment. They can't find normal social connections, and then the NSN, neo-Nazi groups, are really the only place for them to turn to.
Nick, I'd really like to get your view on the idea that banning symbols will somehow help after that protest on the weekend. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about the Nazi salute. We've already got the swastika in some states banned. Do you think it achieves anything?
Listen, it's one tool in what needs to be a much bigger toolbox. I think it's convenient for politicians to say, oh, we'll ban the Nazi salute, we'll ban this, we'll ban that. But ultimately, these groups will simply not do the Nazi salute. What's the really concerning thing is what they're doing behind the scenes when nobody's looking, when they're not in public, plotting, planning, thinking of ways to sow hatred and ultimately, and we hope doesn't get to this stage, I mean, the real risk is an act of extremism or terrorism. And what we need to counter that is a really long-term, sustainable, well-resourced security agency, policing response, and a response by the whole of society, education in our jails, etc. So, yeah, it's well and good that politicians are reacting in this short-term manner, but the fix is far more complicated, far more expensive and far more difficult and potentially politically difficult, and that's where the pressure should be placed on our politicians.
Nick, always good to speak. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.